The night Isidore Rothbart decided to leave the human world forever, Rosalie Langley pressed her hands against his chest and told him he was bleeding out. He looked down at the silver-tipped blade, buried 3 inches below his collarbone, and said, with the particular brand of exhausted aristocracy that only a 700-year-old vampire prince could manage, "I am aware." She had found him in the alley behind her clinic at 2 in the morning, slumped against the damp brick wall with his white hair dark at the ends from rain and his silver eyes half-lidded and utterly heartbreakingly resigned, not in pain, not panicking, just done. As if this were not a wound he intended to survive, and the choice had been made before the blade ever touched him. Rosalie was not the type of woman to ask permission before acting. She had grown up in emergency rooms, had put herself through medical school on 2 jobs and a scholarship she had fought for with every paper she had ever written. She had held the hands of people who wanted to die, and she had argued them back to the living. She knew the difference between a man who could not save it and a man who had simply stopped trying to save himself. She grabbed the hilt of the blade and he caught her wrist with a grip that could have crushed bone, his pale fingers locked around her like iron. "Do not," he said, and his voice was ancient in a way that bypassed her ears and went straight to the oldest part of her brain, the part that remembered what it meant to be prey. "Take your hand off me," she said, meeting his silver eyes without flinching, "or I will make this hurt considerably more than it already does." A beat of silence stretched between them in the rain. Then he released her wrist. She pulled the blade. He did not make a sound. She had her kit with her because she always had her kit with her, a habit her colleagues called obsessive and that had saved 4 lives in the past 2 years alone. She packed the wound with practiced efficiency while he watched her with an expression she could not immediately name. It was not gratitude. It was something rawer than that, and far more dangerous, because it looked like the beginning of a man reconsidering a decision he had already made. "Why?" he said finally, while she was taping the dressing into place, his voice low and careful. "Are you doing this?" "Because you were dying in my alley," she said simply. "I am a vampire. I do not die easily. Silver in the bloodstream says otherwise." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him, rain running down the side of her face, and she said the thing that changed everything between them, though neither of them knew it yet. "And because you looked like someone who had run out of reasons." "I know that look. I refuse to walk away from it." Something moved across his face like a storm crossing an open sea, vast and briefly unguarded, and then the aristocratic mask slid back into place. He was, she would learn, extraordinarily good at masks. He had been called Isidore Rothbart for so long that the name had become the man, though the name itself had been chosen deliberately in the 17th century by a court archivist who had asked what name a prince of the dark intended to carry into the modern age, and had been told to make it sound like something that had survived every empire that had tried to bury it. He had inherited a court, an ancient blood law, and the particular burden of being the last of his bloodline, and he had carried all 3 across 7 centuries with the kind of grace that looked effortless from the outside, and was, on the inside, the most exhausting performance imaginable. The vampire court of Veldrath had existed beneath the city for 300 years. It was not a metaphor. The Veldrath court occupied a subterranean complex beneath what the surface maps listed as a decommissioned rail tunnel network, accessed through 7 different hidden entrances that changed monthly on a rotation system devised by the court's head of security, a vampire named Mordecai Vrene, who had been running intelligence operations since before the age of telegraphs, and who did not trust digital systems on principle. The court was all black marble and gas lighting converted to electricity in the 1940s, and never updated since, so that it burned with an amber glow that made everyone look like paintings of themselves. There were 140 vampires sworn to the court of Veldrath, and every one of them answered to Isidore, and he had, for 7 centuries, answered to no one. That was, in theory, the enviable part. In practice, answering to no one meant there was no one to share the weight with, and the weight had been considerable lately. The ancient blood law called the Edictum Noctis, established in the 13th century by a council of vampire elders who had believed that human-vampire relations needed firm codified regulation before they collapsed into open war, stated among its many provisions that no member of a vampire royal house could establish a blood bond with a human without the formal consent of their court, a witnessed oath before the full assembly, and the agreement of at least 3 other ruling houses. A blood bond was not a casual thing. It was permanent. It was transformative in ways that made both parties permanently, irrevocably altered. It was, in the language of the edictum, a declaration of alignment between 2 worlds that could not be undone, and it came with obligations on both sides that lasted until death, which, in the case of a vampire, was a very long time indeed. Isidore had not been planning a blood bond. He had not been planning anything, which was precisely the problem. He had come to the surface that night, intending to walk away from the court, from the city, from the unending responsibility of being the last prince of a bloodline that had grown exhausted. He had served his court for 7 centuries. He had made every sacrifice the edictum demanded. He had given up 2 lovers to blood law complications, had watched his last remaining council member die in a power struggle with a rival house 40 years ago, and had dismantled that rival house personally and methodically afterward. And he had done all of it while maintaining the appearance of a man who had everything under control. The blade in his chest had been placed there by a vampire named Cassius Vale, who was not a member of the Veldreth court, and who had been sent, Isidore had learned approximately 3 seconds before the attack, by a faction of the Elder Council who had decided that the last Rothbart heir was more useful as a symbol than as a living obstacle, and that a dead prince was easier to replace with a puppet king than a living one was to control. He had defeated Cassius Vale. He had left Cassius Vale alive because he had a policy about killing messengers, and because he wanted whoever had sent Cassius to know that the attempt had failed. He had then walked 3 blocks with a silver blade in his chest, turned into the alley, and sat down against the wall, with no particular intention of standing up again. And then Rosalie Langley had appeared with a medical kit and eyes that did not flinch, and had told him she refused to walk away from the look on his face. He let her bring him inside. Her clinic was small and fiercely organized, everything in its place with a precision that spoke to someone who had learned early that chaos was expensive. There was a framed anatomical chart on the wall beside a child's drawing that said, "Thank you, Dr. Rosalie," in green crayon, and a shelf of medical texts with handwritten tabs, sticking out of them at angles that suggested she had read every one more than once. She had him sitting on the examination table under the fluorescent light before he had fully processed that he had agreed to this, and she was pulling on gloves with the practiced snap of someone who treated 2 in the morning like office hours. "I need to know if the silver is still in the wound or if it tracked into the tissue," she said, not looking at him while she gathered instruments. "And I need you to tell me honestly because vampire healing around silver complications is different from normal." "You have treated vampires before," he said. "It was not quite a question. I treat whoever comes through my door." She finally looked at him, and there was something in that look, direct and steady, that was becoming familiar to him in a way that alarmed him. "The city has more of your kind than most people know. The ones who get hurt at 2 in the morning tend to find me eventually." He watched her work for a long moment before he said quietly, "You know what I am, and you are not afraid of me." "I know what you are," she agreed. "And I know you sat in that alley and did not move for probably 20 minutes while I was finishing up with my last patient. A vampire who intended harm doesn't wait politely." She met his eyes. "Also, you let me pull the blade. That was consent. I tend to trust people who give consent when they're in pain." Something about the matter-of-fact logic of that made something in his chest ease, very slightly, against the tightening that had been there for 40 years. "Isidore Rothbart," he said. "I know who you are," she said. "You have a reputation. Ruling Prince of Veldrath, 700 years old, last of the Rothbart bloodline." She pressed carefully around the wound, and he breathed through the silver sting with controlled discipline. "I also know you look like someone who's been keeping the world together by sheer force of will for so long that you've forgotten to ask whether you actually want to." The silence that followed was the most honest thing he had felt in a decade. She cleaned the wound, extracted 2 small silver fragments she found with an ultrasonic probe adapted from equipment that had been modified for supernatural anatomy by someone she had clearly worked with before, and redressed everything with a competence that would have been remarkable in a clinic twice the size with 10 times the budget. She gave him a blood pack from a refrigerated case in the back, preserved type O, which she produced without being asked and handed to him with the same calm she gave everything. And she said, "Before you tell me you don't need it, the silver slows your regeneration by about 40%, and you lost more than you realize. Your color is terrible." "Vampires do not have color," he said. "You do. You should be pale the way marble is pale, cool and smooth. Right now you're gray the way ash is gray." She sat on the rolling stool across from him and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with those dark eyes that had been looking at him all night like he was something worth understanding. "Drink the blood pack and then tell me why you were sitting in my alley waiting to die." He drank the blood pack. He had not planned to tell her anything. The words came out anyway. He told her about the Addictum Noctis and the faction of elder vampires who had decided the Rothbart line needed to end. He told her about Cassius Vale and the Blade, and about the 40 years since his last council member had died, and about the weight of being the only one left who remembered why any of it had mattered in the first place. He told her about the ancient code of the court that he had upheld through 7 centuries of war and politics and change, and how it had begun to feel like a thing he was maintaining for its own sake, rather than because it served any living purpose. He told her about the moment in the alley when he had sat down and thought, with genuine calm, that perhaps this was simply the end of the Rothbart line, and that he was not certain it was the wrong conclusion. He told her all of this in the measured, controlled tones of a man who had not spoken honestly to another living being in a very long time, and Rosalie Langley listened without interrupting, without offering hollow comfort, without looking at him with pity. She listened the way a good doctor listens, completely, without judgment, giving the words room to exist. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, then she said, "The faction that sent the assassin. They want the court to fall so they can replace you with someone they control." "Yes. Which means the court doesn't fall when you die. The court gets weaponized." He looked at her. There was something very clear in her eyes. "You've been thinking about this as your story ending," she said. "But it's not. It's your story being stolen. Those are different things." She leaned forward slightly. "And I don't think you're the kind of man who lets things be stolen from him." The anger that moved through him was clean and sudden, like a blade cutting through fog, because she was right, and because no one had said it to him that way, and because he had been so exhausted that he had stopped thinking clearly enough to see it. "You are a remarkable woman," he said. "I'm a woman who's heard a lot of people talk themselves toward giving up," she said. "I'm good at spotting the moment the logic is wrong." She stood, smoothing her coat. "The court is worth saving if the alternative is letting people who want to use it win. Whether you've personally run out of reasons is a separate question." He stayed until dawn, which was the entire 40 years that he had remained in one place without obligation pulling him there. He came back the next night, and the night after that, it began as information exchange. Rosalie had contacts in the human medical community that had been quietly building relationships with the vampire population of the city for years, a network she called the Grey Practice, which operated on the principle that sick and injured beings of any species deserved care, and that knowledge shared between worlds prevented catastrophes. She had information about the Elder Council's movements through patients who had come through her clinic, fragments of conversation overheard by people who did not realize. She retained everything she heard with the precision of someone trained to find the diagnostic clue in the detail everyone else dismissed. She gave him intelligence he could not have gotten any other way. He gave her protection she refused to admit she needed until the night 3 members of the Vale faction arrived at her clinic door. He was already there in the back room when the knock came, because he had developed the habit of arriving at her clinic in the early hours. And he had also developed, without fully acknowledging it, the habit of scanning the street outside before he left each morning. He had noted 2 figures following at a distance the previous night, and had said nothing to her because he had not wanted to alarm her, which had been, he recognized in retrospect, a tactical error born of the unfamiliar desire to protect her from worry rather than from harm. The 3 vampires at the door were young by his standards, not more than 2 centuries old, and they had come with a message from Cassius Vale rather than with blades, which was either a diplomatic gesture or a setup. He came out of the back room before she reached the door, positioned himself between her and the entrance, and said in a voice that had been managing courts for 7 centuries, "Tell Cassius that his invitation is declined, and that if any member of his faction sets foot in this building again, I will interpret it as a declaration of war and respond accordingly." The 3 young vampires left without speaking. Rosalie stood behind him in the sudden quiet and said, "You knew they were coming. I suspected. You didn't tell me." He turned to face her, and she was not frightened. She was angry, which was, he was learning, her default response to being left out of information that concerned her safety, and which he found unexpectedly, inconveniently endearing. "I did not wish to concern you unnecessarily. I am a person who makes informed decisions," she said, "not a person who needs to be managed. If there is a threat to this clinic, to my patients, to me, I need to know, whatever the source, whatever the species." Her dark eyes were steady and bright with the kind of anger that was really about principle. "I am not helpless. I am not fragile. Do not treat me like either." "I know you are not," he said, and it came out with more force than he intended, more feeling, because he did know, and because that knowing had become one of the most significant facts in his life over the past 3 weeks. "I know exactly what you are, Rosalie. That is not the reason." He paused, choosing words with the care of someone who did not often say the true thing out loud. "I did not tell you, because I did not want this world to touch you more than it already has. Not because I thought you couldn't handle it, because I did not want you to have to." The anger shifted. Not gone, but rearranged into something quieter. "That's different," she said finally. "Yes, you still should have told me." "Yes," he agreed. "I should have." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Why do you come back here every night, Isidore?" The question was direct in the way all her questions were direct, without preamble or softening, and it deserved an answer in kind. He stood in the amber light of her clinic, with its framed anatomy chart, and its child's drawing, and its shelf of annotated texts, and he said, "Because you are the only place I have been, in a very long time, where the weight of everything lifts." She looked at him for a long, still moment. Then she said, very quietly, "That might be the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me." The situation with the Elder Council escalated 10 days later. Isidore received a formal summons from the Conclave, which was the legislative body of the vampire world, comprising representatives from 17 courts, including 5 elder houses. The summons was written in Old Varic, the ceremonial language of the vampire court system, on paper made from materials he would not have been able to identify without a chemistry degree, and it informed him that a formal petition had been brought before the conclave requesting that the Veldrath court be placed under administrative review pending an assessment of the bloodline's continued fitness to rule. Administrative review was the conclave's polite language for what was in practice a hostile takeover procedure. It had been used twice in recorded vampire history, and both times the court under review had ceased to exist as an independent entity within 50 years. He read the summons in Rosalie's clinic because he had been there when it arrived, delivered by a conclave courier who had been visibly unnerved, to find the Prince of Veldrath in a small human medical clinic at midnight. He read it, and then he set it on her desk with careful precision, and said nothing for a moment. "What does it mean?" she asked. She had been watching his face while he read. "It means the faction that sent Cassius Vale has found a way to move against me through official channels." He picked up the summons again, studying the seals. "It is more sophisticated than I gave them credit for. The conclave review process is difficult to fight directly because it is technically a legitimate governance mechanism. To challenge it, I would need to appear before the full conclave and present evidence that the petition was brought in bad faith. Can you do that? The evidence is there. What I lack is witnesses willing to speak before the conclave." He set the summons down again. "My court has been diminished for 40 years. The witnesses who remember the full truth of the Veldrath bloodline's history, who can testify to the bad faith of the petition, are either dead or have aligned themselves with the faction, bringing the challenge to protect themselves." Rosalie was quiet for a moment, and he recognized the expression on her face, the one she wore when she was working through a diagnostic problem, and building toward the answer from the evidence available. "Your grey practice network," he said. She looked at him. "What about it?" "The vampires in this city who come to you for care. They are not members of my court. They are not aligned with any political faction. They are ordinary members of the vampire community who have no stake in the power struggle." He watched her face. "If any of them have information about the Elder Council's activity, about the faction's history or methods, that testimony would be credible to the conclave precisely because it is politically neutral. You want to ask my patients for help. I want to ask your patients if they are willing to speak truth," he said carefully. "That is a choice I would never compel. But if any of them have information and are willing to give it, it could change the outcome of the conclave hearing." She looked at him for a long moment and then said, "I'll ask. I won't promise, and I won't pressure anyone, but I'll ask." What she found over the next 5 days was more than either of them had anticipated. The grey practice had been operating for 6 years, and in that time Rosalie had treated close to 800 vampire patients. Many of them had come from situations that intersected in ways they had not necessarily connected with the political history of the Elder Council. A vampire woman named Elara, who had been coming for treatment of silver toxicity, had been present at a conclave session 15 years ago, where documentation had been destroyed at the order of an elder named Vorkan, who was the same elder who had signed the petition against the Veldrath court. A vampire man named Drest had worked for the courier system that connected the elder houses and had personally carried correspondence he had never been permitted to read, but had memorized the routing codes that Isidore recognized as the same network used by Cassius Vale. There were 7 witnesses willing to speak. It was more than enough. Isidore prepared for the conclave hearing with a focus he had not felt in years. The particular sharpening of purpose that came from having something worth fighting for. Though he was careful not to look too directly at the source of that clarity, because looking at it directly meant acknowledging things he had not yet decided how to handle. The night before the hearing was when the second attempt on his life came. He was walking back to the court entrance from Rosalie's clinic later than he had intended, because they had been reviewing the witness statements together, and the time had moved without either of them noticing, which had become a pattern he was aware of, and which meant something he was not quite ready to name. He was 3 blocks from the clinic entrance when Cassius Vale stepped out of the shadows with 6 vampires behind him, and unlike the previous encounter, there were no blades. There were 4 humans, unconscious but breathing, arranged in a semicircle on the ground with silver-laced bindings at their wrists and ankles. "The prince presents himself," Cassius Vale said. He was a lean, cold-faced vampire of about 4 centuries, with the particular look of someone who had spent too long in secondary positions and had developed strong opinions about deserving more. "I thought we might speak more directly than letters allow." "Those humans are leverage," Isidore said. "Not a question. Precautionary leverage, if the prince withdraws his appearance before the conclave, forfeits the Veldrath court to administrative review, and departs the city permanently, these 4 return to their homes unharmed, and the prince is free to begin whatever solitary existence he chooses. If the prince refuses, or if he attempts to take action against my companions here, the silver in their bindings will be activated, and they will not survive the exposure." Cassius studied him. Simple, clean, no blood law violation. "Because I have made no threat against a vampire. Only a negotiation." Isidore did not look at the unconscious humans on the ground. He did not need to look to recognize one of them, because he had been paying attention to Rosalie's movements for weeks now, cataloging them as protection, and he knew her jacket and the particular way her hair lay across her shoulder when she was unconscious, and the cold that moved through him was not fear. It was something older and more absolute, a fury so completely controlled that it had become, in that moment, the most dangerous thing in the street. "Release them," he said very quietly. "All 4 now, and I will give you 30 seconds to take your people and leave this street before I stop giving you the mercy of a warning." Cassius Vale smiled. The prince is not in a position to. Isidore moved. 7 centuries of combat refinement, of blood law dueling and court politics enforced with physical authority, of every hard-won lesson about the cost of half measures, compressed into approximately 15 seconds. He dismantled the 6 vampires behind Cassius' veil with the methodical efficiency of someone who was not angry, but who had directed his anger into pure precision, and he was standing in front of Cassius' veil, with Cassius's own silver activation device in his hand, before Cassius had finished processing what had happened. The silver bindings, Isidore said, are deactivated. The humans are unharmed. He looked at Cassius' veil with the weight of 7 centuries behind his eyes. I am going to give you a message to take back to Elder Vorkan. Tell him that his petition dies tomorrow at the conclave hearing. Tell him that I have 7 witnesses and documentation that will expose the fraud at the center of his challenge. And tell him that if he sends anyone near this clinic, near this street, or near any human connected to the Grey practice, I will bring every piece of evidence I have to every ruling house in the conclave, and I will not stop until Vorkan is standing before a blood law tribunal answering for what he has done. He stepped back. Now take your people and go. Cassius' veil went. Isidore knelt beside Rosalie and checked her pulse and her breathing and the silver exposure level at her wrists from the bindings, which was minimal because the device had been deactivated before it could fully engage. And then he simply stayed there for a moment, with his hand covering hers, and his forehead bowed, and every carefully maintained composure cracking, just slightly, at the edges. She woke up 10 minutes later in her clinic, which he had carried her to, and the first thing she said was, "What happened to the others?" "Safe," he said. 3 other clinic patients. I recognize them. They are inside. She sat up, assessed herself with professional speed, and then looked at him. He was standing at the window with his back to her, and his shoulders set with the particular rigidity of a man who has been badly frightened and is refusing to show it. She had been a healer long enough to know what controlled terror looked like when it was wearing its best armor. "Isidore." He turned. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and stood in front of her. And she reached up and put her hand against his face. And the thing that had been between them for weeks, present but carefully unacknowledged, was suddenly right there in the room with both of them. Impossible to step around anymore. "I was afraid for you," he said, in a voice that was nothing like his court voice. Not generally, specifically, entirely. He covered her hand with his. "I do not have the language for what I feel when I think of you in danger. I have 7 centuries of vocabulary, and none of it is sufficient." "That's the most a vampire has ever admitted to me," she said softly. "I suspect it is the most I have admitted to anyone." He turned his face slightly into her palm, a small gesture that cost him considerable pride and which he offered anyway. "You gave me a reason to stay when I had none. I am not certain you understand what that means." "I think I'm beginning to," she said. She kissed him, or he kissed her. The distinction felt less important than the fact of it, than the warmth of it, than the way he held her, like something he intended to keep. Careful and certain and completely present in a way that 7 centuries of survival and court politics had apparently never required him to be. When they broke apart, she looked at him with that direct gaze that had never once flinched from anything he had shown her, and she said, "We have a conclave hearing in the morning or evening, whatever applies." "Evening," he confirmed. "Then we should be ready." The Veldrath court chamber was the most beautiful room Rosalie had ever stood in. It was also, technically, below ground level and lit entirely by amber electric sconces that had not been updated since 1947. But the black marble and the carved arches and the long table set with silver inlaid with bloodwood, which Mordecai Vrenet explained, was the traditional material of vampire governance, and not, he hastened to add, an actual danger to anyone who was not attempting violence, made it feel like standing inside a painting from a different century. The conclave had convened in a larger chamber in the main court complex. 17 representatives seated in a curved arrangement that put the petitioner and the respondent facing each other across a floor of polished black stone. Elder Vorkan was a vampire of immense age, old enough that his stillness had become something slightly outside the ordinary range of motionlessness, as if he had been still for so long that the air around him had simply accepted it. He had white hair like all elder vampires, worn long and loose, and pale eyes with no warmth in them. And he had clearly not expected Isidore to appear at this hearing with 7 witnesses and a collection of documentary evidence organized with the kind of methodical precision that Rosalie had spent 3 days helping to compile. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Elara testified about the document destruction she had witnessed. Dress testified about the routing codes. 5 other witnesses gave accounts that, together, built an unambiguous picture of a political conspiracy that had operated within the conclave itself for over 20 years, using the administrative review process as a weapon against bloodlines it wanted to absorb. Elder Vorkan's defense was, in the end, the defense of a man who had believed he was untouchable for long enough that he had stopped being careful. When the documentation contradicted his account in front of the full conclave, and 3 other elder representatives asked questions that Vorkan could not answer without lying, the hearing shifted from a challenge to Veldrath into something else entirely. The conclave's senior arbiter, a vampire named Seraphiel, who had held the position for 200 years, and who had the expression of someone who had seen everything and was tired of it, declared at the end of the 4th hour that the petition against Veldrath was dismissed with prejudice, and that a separate inquiry into the conduct of Elder Vorkan and the faction he represented would open within 30 days. Vorkan was escorted from the chamber by conclave security officers. His expression as he passed Isidore was not anger. It was something smaller and colder, the expression of a man who had expected one outcome and was reckoning with a different one. Isidore watched him go and felt the weight he had been carrying for 40 years shift very slightly, upward, not gone, but distributed differently, held by a structure that had proven it could bear it. He turned to find Rosalie standing 3 feet behind him, perfectly composed in the formal jacket she had worn specifically because he had told her the conclave considered presentation a form of respect, and she was looking at the chamber around her with the expression she wore when she was absorbing something completely, filing it away with the precision that made her extraordinary at her work. "That's done," she said when she saw him looking. "That is done," he agreed. "What happens now?" It was, he realized, the first time in 40 years that the answer to that question was not determined entirely by obligation or crisis. He looked at her in the amber light of the Veldrath court, in the room he had held together by force of will through 7 centuries of survival, and he said, "Now I decide what I want, rather than what the court requires." She waited. "I want to rebuild the council," he said, "properly, with representatives who are there because they believe in what the court stands for, not because they are afraid of what happens if they refuse. I want to formalize the relationship between Veldrath and the Grey Practice, because the work you do for the vampire community of this city is valuable, and it should have the court's protection and resources instead of operating in the margins." He paused. "And I want to ask you something, which I recognize requires a separate conversation, because it is significant, and I do not intend to raise it in the middle of a political chamber as if it is an afterthought." "Ask it here," she said. "I prefer direct." He almost smiled, which on his face looked like the rearrangement of everything. "I know you do." He crossed to her and stood close, and he said, quietly, only for her, "The blood bond under the edictum is a formal thing. It requires witnesses, consent, and the agreement of 3 ruling houses. I am not asking you to make that decision now, but I am telling you that it exists, and that I am considering it, because you deserve to know the shape of what this is, for me, before either of us goes further." Rosalie was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was thinking, rather than hesitating. "What does a blood bond actually do?" she asked. "It creates a connection between 2 people that is deeply sustaining for both. The vampire becomes anchored to the present in a way that immortality sometimes erodes. The human gains extended lifespan and a degree of resilience they would not otherwise have. It does not make the human a vampire. It creates something that does not have a better name than a partnership that is formally recognized by both worlds." He watched her face. "It also means that if something happens to one, the other knows it. Immediately. Over any distance. That sounds less like a political arrangement, and more like something people do because they love each other," she said. "It is both," he said. "It was designed to be both." She looked at him for a long time. "You said you're considering it." "I am considering it the way I consider all things that I want very much, but that I understand require more than my wanting them," he said. I am considering it the way you consider a diagnosis when all the evidence points on one direction and you are still being careful to rule out alternatives. And what alternatives are you ruling out? The alternative in which this is not mutual, he said. The alternative in which I have interpreted the evidence incorrectly. Rosalie Langley, who had put herself through medical school on 2 jobs and a scholarship, who had built a clinic in a neighborhood the city had tried to forget, who had spent 6 years quietly healing the gap between 2 worlds without asking for acknowledgement or safety, who had pulled a silver blade from a stranger's chest in the rain and refused to walk away from the look on his face, took a step forward and said, "You haven't." He took her hand, and his grip was the same iron certainty he had used every time he had stood between her and danger, but different, open rather than protective, offered rather than claimed. "Then we have something to discuss," he said. "We have time," she said. "We have a lot of time." "We do," he agreed, and there was something in his voice that had not been there the night she found him in the alley. Something that sounded like a man who had stopped counting the weight of the centuries and started counting something else. The weeks that followed were the beginning of a different kind of court. Isidore moved through the reconstruction of the Veldrath Council with a clarity of purpose that Mordecai Vreni, who had served the court through 6 previous reorganizations, privately described as the most focused he had seen the prince in a century. The first new council member was Alara, who had the particular competence of someone who had survived a difficult political environment by being genuinely good at assessing information. The second was an older vampire named Thessaly, who had been running a financial network for the court's external investments for decades, and who had, Isidore had learned, been waiting for an invitation to contribute more formally for the better part of 30 years. The third council seat he offered to Rosalie. She sat across from him in the small room off the main court chamber that he had converted, without ceremony, into a meeting room that worked for both human and vampire schedules, meaning it had proper lighting, a coffee machine, and chairs that did not require formal court posture. She had a mug of coffee in her hands, and she was looking at him with the expression she wore when she was running scenarios. "I'm human," she said. "I am aware. The Edictum Noctis doesn't prohibit human council members." "The Edictum Noctis was written in the 13th century, he said. "There are aspects of it that require revision and aspects that are simply silent on situations the original authors did not anticipate. A human healer with established relationships across both communities and demonstrated intelligence in political matters falls into the category of simply not anticipated. You're telling me there's no rule against it. There is no rule against it." She drank her coffee. "I have a clinic. I know I'm not giving up my clinic. I would not ask you to. The council meets twice monthly in formal session and informally as needed. The Grey practice would operate under the court's protection with access to its resources, which are considerably more substantial than you might expect from a subterranean organization that hasn't updated its lighting in 75 years. She looked at him. He met her eyes with the calm patience of someone who had spent 7 centuries learning that some things worth having require the person worth having them from to arrive at their own conclusion without being pushed. "Yes," she said. He did not show relief, because he had been quite certain she would say yes, but there was something in his shoulders that settled, very slightly, that had not been settled when they had started this conversation. The Grey practice moved into newly designated clinic space within the court complex, a suite of rooms that had previously been storage, and that were converted over 3 weeks into a modern medical facility that made Rosalie's original clinic look like a first draft, though she insisted on keeping the original clinic operating as well, because the surface-level community it served still needed it, and Isidore agreed without argument and arranged for the court to fund it. The child's drawing that said, "Thank you, Dr. Rosalie," in green crayon, went up on the wall of the new clinic on the first day. Mordecai Vreni, who had been expecting to find the transition to having a human council member deeply uncomfortable, found himself instead engaged in a lengthy conversation with Rosalie about the historical intelligence operations of the Veldrath court and contributing for the first time in decades to something that felt collaborative rather than simply maintained. Elder Vorkan's inquiry concluded 6 weeks after the conclave hearing. The findings were significant enough to trigger 3 separate bloodline investigations, all of which had been in various states of political suppression for years. 2 other courts that had been in the faction's political shadow requested formal alignment with Veldrath, citing the court's demonstrated stability and the apparently unique model it was developing for human-vampire cooperation, which was not something any court had formalized before, and which was generating considerable attention in the wider vampire world. Isidore handled the diplomatic conversations with his characteristic combination of complete authority and absolute precision. Rosalie sat in on 3 of them and contributed at moments that made the visiting representatives visibly recalibrate their assessment of the Veldrath court's current composition, which was, she told Isidore afterward, enormously satisfying. The formal blood bond conversation happened on a night in late autumn when the city above them was cold and bright and the court chamber was quiet. They had been in the small meeting room late, going through a proposed revision to the addictum section on human-vampire relations that a joint conclave subcommittee had asked Isidore to review, and the work had slowed and softened into conversation, and then into the particular comfortable silence that had become, over the months, one of his favorite things in a very long life. "I want to," she said, without preamble, because she had been thinking about it, and she was, as always, direct. He looked at her. He had learned to read her silences well enough to know this was not the beginning of a thought, but the conclusion of one she had been working toward for some time. "The bond," she said. "I've read everything I could find about it. I've asked Elara and Thessaly and Mordecai, which I think he found deeply unexpected. I've thought about what it means practically and what it means personally." She met his eyes. I want to, Rosalie." His voice was very careful, the way it was careful when he was being exact. "I need you to know that this cannot be undone. It is not a decision you can revisit in a year if circumstances change. It is as permanent as the words in the addictum, and it will extend your life in ways that will eventually diverge from the lives of the people around you, from colleagues, from patients, from the ordinary human timeline. It is not without cost." "I know," she said. "I'm a healer. I understand what long life looks like from the outside. I've thought about the cost." She looked at him steadily. "I've also thought about what it looks like to spend a long life with someone who actually sees me. And I've thought about what it looks like to walk away from that, because I was afraid of the inconvenience of living longer." "It will not always be easy," he said. "Nothing I've built has ever been easy," she said. "That's not a reason." He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "Then I will arrange the required consents and the witnesses," he said. "And I will do it properly with every formality the addictum demands, because you deserve to have this done with the full weight of the court behind it." "I do not need ceremony," she said. "I know," he said, "but I want to give it to you. There is a difference." He looked at her with 7 centuries of accumulated careful restraint lowered, completely, in a way that she had learned to recognize as the most significant gesture in his emotional vocabulary. "You gave me a reason to stay when I had decided there were none left. I would like the court, the conclave, and every ruling house that cares to pay attention to know that." She looked at him for a long, still moment, and then she smiled. The particular smile that she did not give often enough, and that he had been cataloguing every instance of because he was at core a man who collected things he considered precious. "All right," she said. "Then do it properly." The ceremony was 3 weeks later. The conclave sent 4 representatives, which was more than the required 3 ruling house agreements, and which Cetrafiel, the senior arbiter, indicated with the closest thing to warmth she seemed capable of, was a reflection of considerable interest in what the Veldrath court was demonstrating. The court chamber was full for the first time in 40 years. Elara stood in one of the witness positions with the expression of someone who was watching history and knew it. Mordecai Vren stood in the other with the expression of someone who had been surprised by this entire sequence of events and had decided the surprise was acceptable. Isidore stood at the center of the chamber in the formal court attire that he wore, with the effortless ease of someone who had never found armor uncomfortable, white hair precise and silver eyes steady, and he was looking at Rosalie. Rosalie had worn the formal gown that Elara had helped her select because she had asked for help, which was something she had learned to do more willingly in the past several months, and it was deep blue because Isidore had said, once, only once. That blue against her complexion made him lose his train of thought, and she had filed that information away for exactly this use. She was not nervous. She was present in the way she was present, with patience, completely, and without reservation. The arbiter spoke the formal words of the edictum in Old Varic and then in modern language, as was the current convention. The exchange of vows was simple by design, because Isidore had written them that way, and they said what was true rather than what was traditional. He spoke first. "I vow to stand between you and every danger that comes from either world," he said, and his voice filled the chamber with the quiet certainty of a man who did not make statements he did not intend to keep. "I vow to tell you the truth in all things, even those that are difficult. I vow to see you as you are completely, without diminishment. I vow that you will never face anything alone that I have the power to face beside you." He paused, and then he said the part that was not in the traditional form at all, that he had added because it was the truest thing he could offer. "You asked me nothing and gave me everything," he said. "You found me at the end of myself and refused the conclusion I had reached. That is a debt I cannot repay by any formula the edictum provides, so instead I offer what I have, every remaining century of this life, used in partnership with yours. That is my vow." The chamber was very quiet. Rosalie spoke clearly, without pageantry, which was entirely itself. "I vow to be honest with you when honesty is the harder choice," she said. "I vow to keep learning what you need instead of assuming I know. I vow to stand in every room you stand in as myself, not as a shadow or an accessory or a symbol of anything, and to require the same from you." She held his gaze. "You told me you had run out of reasons. I intend to keep giving you new ones for as long as we both have time. That is my vow." The arbiter completed the formal declaration. The bond settled between them with the particular quality that the edictum's authors had described as recognition, as if two parts of a larger pattern had found the arrangement they had always tended toward, and both of them felt it. A warmth and a solidity that was different from feeling, but was not less than feeling. Something structural. Something that was now simply part of how the world was organized. He kissed her in the chamber of the Veldrath court, in front of the conclave representatives and the witnesses, and the 140 vampires of his court. And she kissed him back with the same directness she gave everything, and the chamber that had been quiet erupted into the kind of sound that old rooms make when they have waited a long time for an occasion worthy of them. Mordecai Vrene was later reported to have smiled, which 3 separate members of the court agreed was unprecedented, though he denied it when asked. The months that followed were the fullest that either of them had lived. The grey practice grew. The formal relationship between the Veldrath court and the human medical community that Rosalie had been quietly building for 6 years became, with the court's backing and the conclave's cautious recognition, the first formally acknowledged cross-world health network in the city's history. Other cities took note. 2 other vampire courts sent inquiries about establishing similar programs. Rosalie trained 3 additional healers in cross-species medicine and wrote the first comprehensive guide to vampire anatomy and pathology that was designed for human medical practitioners, a work that Isidore proofread with the attention to detail of someone who had been living inside the subject for 7 centuries, and who had several strong opinions about the section on silver toxicity. The court rebuilt itself with a velocity that surprised even Mordecai, who had seen 4 previous periods of reconstruction and had developed pessimistic expectations about the timeline. Elara turned out to be extraordinarily good at identifying talent in the wider vampire community, people who had been waiting for an invitation to something that was genuinely building rather than merely maintaining. Thessaly restructured the court's financial architecture in ways that created stability that had not existed since the previous century. The council met formally twice monthly and informally, in practice considerably more often, because the small meeting room, with the coffee machine, had become the kind of place where things actually got decided. Isidore moved through all of it, with the particular quality of a man who had discovered that competence and purpose feel different when they are oriented towards something you have chosen rather than something you have inherited. He was still the most dangerous presence in any room he entered. He was still the kind of authority that older vampires instinctively deferred to and newer vampires found both intimidating and clarifying. He was still the Prince of Veldrath in every register that word implied, and he was also, visibly, unmistakably, a man who was deeply in love, which the court found simultaneously undignified and completely consistent with the Rothbart bloodline's historical tendency to commit to things with absolute finality once they committed at all. He told her this one evening. In the comfortable half-light of the quarters he had redesigned to include a proper sleeping space, because she now divided her time between the clinic complex and the court, and he had learned, somewhat humblingly, that humans required considerably more sleep than he had been accounting for in his room design. The Rothbart line was known for it, he said. He was sitting on the edge of the bed and she was beside him, with her head against his shoulder, the position they had arrived at through the usual negotiation of two people learning each other's geography. My predecessor, who held the court 3 centuries before me, wrote 2 volumes of poetry for his bondmate. They are still in the court library. Mordecai finds them deeply embarrassing. "Have you read them?" she asked. "Several times," he said. "They are genuinely good." He had the advantage of living in a century when that kind of extended sentiment was considered appropriate rather than excessive. "Do you have opinions about what's appropriate to say?" she asked, and there was something in her voice that was almost teasing, which he had learned to recognize, and which he found, consistently unexpectedly charming. "I have opinions about timing," he said, "and about the difference between sentiment that means something and sentiment that is performed." He tilted his head slightly to look at her. "What I feel for you does not fit in the language of performed sentiment. It is too specific." He paused. "Every morning when you leave for the surface clinic, I am aware of exactly where you are, not in an intrusive way, in the way that you are aware of the weight of something you are holding. Present and real and mine to carry." She was quiet for a moment. "That's better than 2 volumes of poetry," she said. "I have 7 centuries of vocabulary," he said. "I should be able to manage at least that much." She laughed, and the sound of it in the quiet of the room was, as it always was, precisely the thing that the room had needed. There was one more significant moment, one that neither of them had anticipated, and that arrived with the blunt practicality that most significant things preferred to large dramatic entrances. Seraphiel, the conclave's senior arbiter, came to the Veldrath court personally, without a representative, which was unusual enough that Isidore had Mordecai run a threat assessment before the visit that came back entirely clear. She came with a proposal from the full conclave that the Veldrath court take on a formal role in the administration of the cross-world governance structure, specifically the drafting of a new supplementary protocol to the Edictum Noctis that would address human-vampire relations in the modern world, a revision that was long overdue and that the conclave had been avoiding for decades because no court had ever had both the credibility and the relevant practical experience to write it. "We are not asking for control," Seraphiel said. Sitting in the council chamber, with the stillness of 200 years' service and a clear set of expectations about her time. "We are asking for expertise. Your court has something no other court has built in the modern era. The protocol needs to reflect what is actually possible, not what was imagined in the 13th century. Isidore looked at Rosalie, who was sitting at the council table because she was on the council, and who had been listening to Seraphiel with the expression she wore when she was building her response. "I have conditions," Rosalie said. Seraphiel raised one ancient eyebrow. "Any revision to the edictum that addresses human-vampire relations needs human input," Rosalie said. "Not just vampire court interpretation of what humans need, actual human perspective, from people who live and work in the interface between both communities." She looked at Seraphiel steadily. "I can facilitate that. I know who the right people are, but it has to be a genuine consultation, not a formality." Seraphiel was quiet for a moment in the way that very old beings are quiet when they are being honestly surprised. Then she said, "That is a reasonable condition." "Also," Rosalie said, "the section of the edictum that deals with blood bonds needs to be clarified to explicitly acknowledge that the bond does not diminish either party's autonomy or existing obligations. The current language is ambiguous enough that it has been used historically to argue that a bonded human has reduced independent standing, which is both ethically wrong and practically counterproductive. You have read the edictum, Seraphiel said. Cover to cover, Rosalie said. In the original Old Varick and the modern translation, I borrowed both copies from the court library. There was a silence in the council chamber that had a particular quality to it, the quality of a room adjusting its understanding of the situation. Mordecai Vren later described it as one of the 4 most significant moments he had witnessed in 3 centuries of court service, which from Mordecai was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The protocol revision process took 8 months and produced a document that was subsequently cited by 6 other courts as the foundation for their own human-vampire relations policies. Rosalie wrote 3 sections of it personally and co-wrote 2 others with Elara. Isidore oversaw the formal submission to the conclave and stood before the full assembly to present it, and when he spoke about the court's experience and the principles underlying the protocol, he cited the Grey practice by name and its founder by name, and said, with the complete unembarrassed certainty of a man who had 7 centuries of practice at meaning what he said, that the revision would not exist without the intelligence and care of a specific human healer, who had refused to walk away from the look on a stranger's face in a dark alley, and who had subsequently refused to walk away from anything at all. The conclave passed the protocol without dissent, which Seraphiel indicated privately to Isidore was the first unanimous vote in 40 years. On the evening after the vote, they walked together in the court's long gallery, which ran above the main chamber and which had windows cut into the vaulted ceiling that showed not the actual sky, but a projected image of it. A concession to aesthetics made by a previous generation that Isidore had always found slightly melancholy and now found rather beautiful. The city above them was moving through its ordinary evening, unaware of the court beneath it, of the vote that had just changed the governance architecture of 2 parallel worlds, of the prince and the healer walking in the amber light and talking about nothing in particular in the people way of 2 Opo who have stopped needing significant occasions to have significant conversations. Are you happy? She asked. Which was a question she asked with some regularity because she believed in checking rather than assuming, and which he answered each time with the same seriousness she gave it. Yes, he said, without hesitation. And then, because he was precise, in the way that I understand happiness, which is not the way it is described in the court's poetry, which seems to require constant transport and very little rest. It is quieter than that. It is the sense that the world is the right shape. He looked at her. You are the right shape of the world. She looked up at the projected sky and then back at him, and there was in her face everything that had been building since an alley in the rain, since a man with a silver blade in his chest and 7 centuries of exhaustion behind his eyes, since a woman who had said I refused to walk away from that look, and had not once, not for a moment. We should go check on the evening clinic intake, she said. We should, he agreed. Mordecai sent a report about the 2 new court alignment requests. We should review it. We should. And I have a patient follow-up to write up from the afternoon session. Yes, he stopped walking and turned to face her and took both her hands, and the court stretched around them in its amber beauty, ancient and rebuilt, and full of purpose again, and he said, all of that, all of it every evening exactly like this. That is what I want. Not an ending, not an escape. This. She squeezed his hands and said, then that's what we have. And they did. The Veldrath court continued to grow and change. Guided by a council that brought together the oldest institutional memory of the vampire world with perspectives that the edictum's original authors had never imagined it would contain. The Grey practice became the most sophisticated cross-species medical operation in the city's history, and then, within a decade, in the region's history, expanding into a network that Rosalie managed with the same fierce organized precision she had always applied to everything she built. She trained a generation of healers who learned as their first lesson that effective care required understanding the full context of the person in front of you, their world, their history, their particular quality of need. Isidore rebuilt the Rothbart bloodline, not through blood succession, which the old court politics would have demanded, but through a formal legacy structure that the conclave eventually recognized as a governance innovation, establishing that a court's continuity could be secured through institutional identity and chosen alliance rather than only through biological inheritance. It was, several historians of the vampire world noted, the most significant governance reform since the edictum itself, and it was driven by the particular clarity of a prince who had stopped performing survival and started choosing life. They argued sometimes, with the particular heat of two people who were both accustomed to being right, and who did not yield on things that mattered to them. Rosalie had strong opinions about process and consent that occasionally collided with Isidore's older instincts toward unilateral protective action. Isidore had a patience for certain kinds of political maneuvering that Rosalie found infuriating when it involved delaying something that seemed obviously urgent to her. They learned each other's edges and did not pretend those edges were not there, and they came back from every argument with more information about each other than they had before, which was, Rosalie told Alara once, the only way she had ever wanted to do things. Mordecai Vren eventually admitted, in a private moment that he swore never happened, that the Veldrath court under the current arrangement was the finest iteration of it he had served in his 3 centuries of experience. Alara rose to lead the council's intelligence function with a competence that rewrote the court's external relationships. Thessaly eventually found a protégé in a young vampire from one of the newly aligned courts who had a gift for financial architecture that made the old man, for the first time in decades, genuinely excited about his work. The small meeting room with the coffee machine remained the heart of the operation, slightly expanded now to accommodate the larger council, but still recognizably the room where everything was actually decided, still lit by the amber sconces that Isidore had finally admitted were not going to be updated anytime soon, because he had developed, over 7 centuries, opinions about atmosphere. Rosalie's green crayon drawing still hung on the clinic wall. She had been offered, more than once, to have it framed properly, and she had declined each time, because it looked right where it was, and she saw no reason to change a thing that was already right. They had centuries ahead of them, both of them, together. That was what the bond meant, and they had both chosen it with their eyes completely open, knowing all the edges of what it was and wanting it anyway. On a night several years after the conclave vote, when the city above was quiet and the court below was settled in its work, and the amber light lay over everything with the softness of long familiarity, Isidore found Rosalie in the gallery above the main chamber, standing at the projected window and looking at the simulated stars. "You're thinking about something," he said. He had learned to recognize the particular quality of her stillness, when her mind was actively working rather than resting. "I'm thinking about the night I found you," she said, "in the alley." He came to stand beside her, looking at the stars. "What about it? You'd decided it was over," she said. "You'd run all the logic and come to a conclusion, and you were sitting there sitting for the conclusion to arrive." "Yes. And then I pulled the blade and gave you a blood pack and told you I refused to walk away." She turned to look at him. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I'd been 5 minutes later?" He was quiet for a moment. "I do not find that a productive line of thought," he said carefully. "I don't find it unproductive," she said. "I find it clarifying. Because it reminds me that most things that matter happen because of 5 minutes. Because of one decision. Because one person refuses the obvious conclusion and does something differently." She looked at him with the directness that had never changed, not one degree of it. "You were the reason I was still at the clinic that late. I had a patient intake that ran over. If it hadn't, I would have been home 2 hours before you came into my alley." He looked at her. "You're saying it was contingent." "I'm saying everything worth having is contingent," she said, "and that the only response to that is to hold it properly. Not desperately, just properly, with both hands." She took his hand, and he turned his completely over so that she was holding it, rather than the other way around, which was, she had observed, his way of allowing something without directing it. "We could have missed each other. But we did not," he said. "But we did not," she agreed. The projected sky above them shifted from stars to the first pale suggestion of dawn, the automated transition of a system installed decades ago by court technicians who had thought it poetic. Isidore, who could not stand in actual dawn, and who had long ago made peace with that fact, watched the simulated light move across the vault of the ceiling, and thought about 7 centuries, about weight and purpose, and the particular shape of a reason to stay. He had stopped trying to name what Rosalie Langley was to him, because the naming kept falling short. She was the healer who had found him in the rain. She was the woman who had stood in front of Cassius Vale's messengers without a single tremor. She was the voice at the council table that cut through every evasion to the actual question. She was the person he thought of first with every significant thing, and second with everything else, and whose laugh in a quiet room was still. After all this time, precisely what the room had needed. She was the reason. She was every reason. He had told her once, early, that he had 7 centuries of vocabulary, and none of it was sufficient. He had since concluded that sufficiency was not the point. The point was the attempt. The continued, daily, genuine attempt to say what was true and mean what was said, and show up for the life that had been, against all of his expectations, and through the impossible contingency of a late clinic intake and an alley in the rain, given back to him. "We should go in," he said when the simulated dawn had deepened to full morning. "You have the early intake. I have a report from the aligned courts." "We do," she agreed. "The protocol committee wants a response to the secondary amendment proposal by the end of the week. I'll have it ready by Thursday. And Mordecai wants to discuss the Eastern Network expansion. We can do that in the afternoon session." She turned away from the projected window and looked at him, and she was smiling with everything in her face, nothing held back. "We have a lot to do." "We do," he said, and the way he said it was not weighted or resigned or performed. It was simple, it was true. It was the voice of a man who had sat down in the rain and intended not to rise again, and who had been given, by the most unlikely possible intervention of a woman who refused wrong conclusions and kept her kit with her at 2 a.m, every reason to. He took her hand, and they walked together back through the amber-lit corridors of the Veldrath court toward the council chamber and the clinic and the work they had built, toward the city above them that did not know what lived beneath it, and the world that was larger than it suspected, and the long, extraordinary future that stretched ahead of both of them, full of purpose and full of each other, with nothing left unresolved and nothing left behind.